Georgie Dent. Georgie is an author and an advocate. She's the founder and CEO of the Parenthood, an Australian-based advocacy organization representing the voices of parents and carers. And I'm delighted that while she is on sabbatical in Canada, she's taken a few minutes to chat with me and chat with you all today. Georgie, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the sabbatical because that's really why I decided to reach out to you. We had met virtually before, but then received an email announcing that you were going on sabbatical from the Parenthood and you were going to focus on your own parenting, your own journey, and in a different country from where you normally live. So I'd just love to hear what has the experience of the last several months of being on sabbatical from your professional work to lean into your family life. What has that been like?
Yeah, it has been a roller coaster, if I'm honest with you. And I think that I would only ever be honest with you. But yeah, it has been a roller coaster. There have been some incredible highs, but it's also been tough, setting up a family life, or setting up any life in another country where you haven't got an established sort of village or community. It's a really big thing. And when you throw in, we've got 3 school-aged children, so they are now 7, 11, and 13. And it's a huge undertaking. I guess probably the other part of it that makes it quite a big undertaking was that, as you said, the organisation that I am the CEO of, we are a small advocacy-based organisation, and being a small organisation makes it a little bit harder when you're making a decision to take the time that I have. And I guess one of the ways I've described it is it's like I'm taking parental leave, but without the baby. And so getting the organisation as well as our family set up to take this leap for 6 months, it took a lot of work. I am really, really grateful that we did it. And even though it hasn't been perfectly straightforward, I genuinely believe that what each of us in the family will individually take from this, but also as a family unit, I do think that we kind of know we can do some things that are hard and we can persevere when everything feels quite unfamiliar. And I think that is a sort of blessing to have that knowledge.
That's great. One thing you said early on in that response was that you don't have the village, and I think as you probably know, at Capita, a big part of our work is focused on building a culture of solidarity and care. So,
Mm-hmm.
moving from Sydney to Toronto with your family, any insights about sort of the shape that the village must take to better support children and families from your own experience of not having one over the last several months?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have always known how important the village is when it comes to raising children, particularly. Well, actually, no, I guess I knew it more from the smaller children piece. When you've got babies and toddlers, you really are sort of physically and emotionally stretched in ways that really need to be recognized and really need to be supported. And if you don't have a community or a village around you, it's really difficult. And I think I probably was a little bit naive about how much, even now with our children being a bit older, how important the village still is. And I guess things that we found, so when we first moved over here, we had a bit of a hiccup with the first house that we were supposed to be living in. And we had this mad week where we had to try and find somewhere else to live. But we had our 3 children with us and we didn't know a single person. So there was no opportunity for sort of one of us to go off and work it out. We kind of had to actually do it all together as a family. And being in that position does sort of put a lot of pressure on the family unit, because in an ideal world, as the parents, we would be making decisions and sorting out logistics without that being an open for discussion, interactive experience with the whole family. But we didn't have the luxury of sort of separating ourselves. And I think the other thing that we have felt is, if you are fortunate to sort of enjoy where you live and you've built up that community so that you can, the kids can walk down to the park, or our eldest daughter catches the bus to school and things like that, but they've got people around them that they know. I've got people around me that I know. All of us not having those little touch points at the same time, it puts a lot of pressure on the relationships and what it's sort of required. So it has definitely reinforced to me how important it is to have a sort of familiar, trusted people around you. And whether that's at the school, whether it's when the kids were younger, when it was at the sort of daycare that they went to, whether it's your neighbours, those relationships really matter, I think, for everyone.
And in this last, I think it's been maybe almost 6 months, right, that you've been living in a new place. I mean, have you started to build relationships with people in, either through your kids' schools or through in the neighborhood, that have given you a sense of just what it is like for people who are new to a place to build the sorts of relationships that are necessary for flourishing in a new place?
Yeah, and look, I guess in that way, our girls being at school created an easier opportunity to meet people. We are quite fortunate that the local public school in this area is actually kindergarten to grade 8, which meant all 3 of our girls could be at the same location, which was a huge blessing, because a lot of them are split, and it might be kindergarten to year 6, and then from year 6 upwards is at a different campus. We very early on, the school started on a Tuesday. Actually, the Monday afternoon before school started, there was a meet and greet at the school for anyone who wanted to come. And that was a real mix of local families, but also a couple of new families. And we met sort of almost immediately 2 other families, one that had moved from the States, and another family that had moved from Brazil back here. And we've all sort of ended up living within a few streets of each other. Our kids aren't actually in the same grades, but having met other families in the same boat has been quite nice. And it's not that we've sort of established a relationship where we're already best friends and all the children are running between each other's houses. That's not where we're at. But it's been really, I guess, having the familiar face at the school drop-off on various days. One of us, someone's child is having a difficult time, seeing someone being able to say or send a message afterwards, how are you going? I hope that was okay. We've all ended up in all of the families, everyone has had COVID. And that's another thing where it's sort of like there was, people could drop off soup or they could take a kid to school. Those sorts of relationships count, that I suppose is the village. And then the other thing that I have really noticed is that the teachers themselves at the girls' school have been quite an amazing support as well. Sort of being able to have someone else who's seeing your child and kind of knowing your child has been another, I guess it's been an important relationship from my perspective.
So you said you were taking parental leave without the baby. For those who are joining us today, could you just narrate that? Like, you are the CEO of an organization that a lot of people in our audience outside of Australia have probably never heard of. So tell us, like, what you normally do, and what led to the decision around parental leave without the baby, rather than just trying to do the job for 6 months from Toronto.
Yeah. Okay. So I run an organisation called the Parenthood. We are an advocacy organisation. We represent about 85,000 parents and carers around Australia. And our mission is to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent. And that's quite deliberate. And it gets back to that village point, because we know that if you do not support parents and caregivers, you cannot support children. And so that's why we're quite deliberate in our framing, and the policies that we are seeking to change are around paid parental leave, access to quality early childhood education and care, and access to family-friendly workplaces, truly family-friendly workplace practices. And we basically mobilise the parents in our community to try and affect change. And we do that through using parents' stories on social media, directly lobbying government at a state and a federal level. We do research. And I have been the CEO for 3 years. I was on the board of the organisation for just over a year before that. We are not for profit and we're independent. It's a really big job, and we have had it's been a really effective couple of years in Australia. We have had, after sort of a decade with very little change, we have had some big improvements and commitments around paid parental leave and access to early education and care. There's still a lot of work to do because we're nowhere near the sort of bold policy reform that we need. But it's been a big job, and because we are a small organisation, but we do have quite a big media profile, it was tricky to sort of, and I went back and forth in my head about what I thought would be the best thing for the organisation as well as the family. The context for this period is that my husband had he finished surgical training about a year ago, and in Australia, if you've done surgical training, you really do need to do a post overseas for at least 6 months at the end of your training to sort of, ultimately try and secure a public hospital appointment. And so we had known for a long time that something like this would be on the cards. And then at the beginning, it was January this year that we found out he'd been offered this 6-month position here in Toronto, and we thought 6 months was doable. And then it got a bit, I had some hypothetical conversations with the board about what we might do. But when the offer was there and when we sort of committed, it was time to make a decision. And ultimately, I knew in my heart of hearts that I couldn't do the job justice from here, and I couldn't do my family justice if I was trying to do the job justice. And so, quickly, actually, the board came around and sort of said, you know what, actually, it is like parental leave. If you were having a baby, we need to be able to accommodate that. And so I guess we kind of quite quickly turned it from a problem to an opportunity. We spoke to the sort of our various funding partners, and everyone was so, and I guess it shouldn't come as a surprise, but everyone was so supportive and welcoming of the idea. And it meant that we were able to bring, we've got an acting CEO who's doing an incredible job. And recruiting, that was a big part of how we knew we could make this work. We needed to get somebody with the right set of skills. And I think that I knew this from the minute we arrived here. I could not have tried to do the job from here. There's a lot of in-person advocacy. There's a lot of media. There's a lot of real time. You've got to meet with families. You've got to connect families with other sort of decision makers or media. I couldn't have done it from here effectively. And I did make the choice ultimately that I wanted to put my family first. But in doing that, I actually also was putting the organisation first, because I know that these 6 months have been much more productive than they could have been if I was trying to do it from here.
Yeah. Georgie, one thing that I notice about the Parenthood and the way that you just framed your work is that you all are focused on making Australia the best place to be a parent in the world.
Yeah.
I think most organizations that are organizations of parent advocates in particular, or advocacy organizations that represent parents and caregivers, they often say they want some place to be the best place to be a child. And parents are sort of the advocates on behalf of the children. What you're saying, I think, is quite interesting is, you all are really advocates on behalf of parents and carers and want to make Australia the best place to be a parent or a carer in the world. And I think you probably would say that means it's going to be a great place to be a child too. But could you just narrate that? Because that does sort of surprise me in terms of what we often hear in advocacy, at least here in the United States.
Yeah, look, we are really deliberate in our framing because we know that if it's that classic analogy that you can't pour from an empty cup. Now, if we don't provide parents with the right support to enable them to look after their children, the children can't thrive and the parents can't thrive. One of the things that I've watched with a bit of interest over the last couple of years, and really it started in the pandemic, is the rise of Dr. Becky. So I'm a psychologist from America who's sort of a best-selling author. A lot of her content is around, technically people would say, I'm seeking out Dr. Becky's advice because I'm having XYZ problems, with my child, and I need to be able to manage this scenario, whether it's bedtime, whether it's food, whether it's behavioral, social anxiety. Almost all of her content is actually aimed at supporting you as a parent and equipping you as a parent to be in a position to support your child. And there is, we know that the research is really clear that when parents have got so we advocate for 1 year of paid parental leave that's shared between parents where there are two parents, 1 year when there's a single parent. And the reason for that is that we know the evidence is so clear that if you give parents that opportunity to bond, set up the connection, set up the trust, set up the routine, effectively skill up in parenting without having to have the sort of all-consuming financial pressure and fear of, how we're going to actually provide for our family, outcomes for children are improved. We know that. We know that the mental health of parents, positive mental health for parents has a positive impact on the mental health of children. And so that is why we are really deliberate in our framing, that we know if we don't look after parents and carers, we're not going to look after children. They are inextricably linked in a way. And one of the issues that we've got in Australia is, and actually I would say that this is probably quite common around the world, you're going to be hard pressed to find somebody who doesn't say, I want the best outcomes for children. That's it would probably be a bit of a monster who says, I would love for children to sort of, right, flail and be neglected and vulnerable and not flourish. But what we don't really then go to is, well, if we do care about children having the best outcomes, then what sort of ecosystem do we need those children to exist in? And that's really where it's clear to us that parents and caregivers are so fundamental to the well-being of children. And if we don't have an ecosystem that holds and supports, equips, nourishes parents, children will flail. And that is something that there's definitely a tension point, because certainly in Australia we have had over the last couple of years, and you still hear it from time to time, there's sort of this suspicion, or it's disparaging of parents in a way that, parents, they just want access to, they want paid parental leave. They just, it's almost like they're welfare cheats. Oh, they want this and they want that. And it really, I think, is quite revealing that we don't really value the role of parents, even people who would say, I value children and I want children to do well. And I guess we're trying to be quite explicit about that connection between the well-being of parents and the well-being of children, because we don't think we can improve outcomes for children if we don't improve the ecosystem for parents.
So, Georgie, one of the things I love about that is that it really affirms, I think, the dignity and the vocation even of parenting, and the need for parents to flourish independent of their flourishing as being a sort of means to the end of a flourishing child. They flourish together, right? That's I think in some ways the message. So, tell me, like, how can we tell that story? What are you learning in terms of how we tell the story of flourishing parents rather than just stressed, anxious, and depressed parents?
Yeah, I think it starts with a fundamental reevaluation or reassessment of caring, and of what it is, because I think for a long time it's sort of been easy to just write parenting and caring off as something that happens behind closed doors and everyone can just get on with it and do it, and everyone has a hard time and you just sort of make do. We know the research is so clear about the ways in which both children and parents are struggling. We know that the pandemic has only sort of exacerbated pre-existing challenges. So, in Australia, we've got a situation where nationally 20% of children arrive at school when they're 5, developmentally vulnerable. So that's 20% in any given classroom, developmentally vulnerable. We know that those children who arrive at school developmentally vulnerable are about half as likely to overcome those vulnerabilities by the time they finish school. So, and we know that so the picture in Australia is that for children who live in regional and rural areas, 40% of children are developmentally vulnerable when they arrive at school. Among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, it's half. And one of the things that we are trying to do, and one of the sort of campaigns that we're involved in, is Thrive by 5. And it's talking about looking at the importance of what happens between the ages of 0 and 5. And it is not something that individual parents should be forced to navigate alone behind closed doors, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work well enough for their children. It doesn't work well enough for them. So we've got this sort of unique window where we can quite literally change the trajectory of a child's life. But we have to look at those years between 0 and 5 as profoundly important and use that as our starting point when we're then designing policies, because that is the only way we can affect sort of widespread change for the most amount of children. And we know that things like having access to high quality early childhood education and care that's delivered by professionally paid and supported educators is quite literally the most significant thing we could do for a child with any form of vulnerability, whether it's sort of socioeconomic vulnerability, whether it's whatever is happening in their house. If they have got any sort of vulnerability, having access to great quality early learning changes their trajectory. And it also, again, it comes back to the point we made about the village. When you've got somewhere else where your child can be cared for and where they can be, they're in the care of trusted, professional, skilled adults, that creates an opportunity for the parent as well. It creates an opportunity for the parent to feel connected to the community. But also, in a practical sense, and this is where obviously for parents, single parents in particular, if you haven't got somewhere that is safe and totally affordable for your child to go, you can't go to work. Now, in Australia, we don't have a welfare system that makes it, I would say it is almost impossible to raise a child in Australia and not have some form of independent income. Anyway, sorry, I've rambled a bit there, but I guess it's really looking at reframing the way we look at 0 to 5 and looking at what the key policies are that then impact parents and caregivers and then children.
Mm-hmm. We at Capita, we talk a lot about context, and we talk about, for example, the context of climate change that is impacting the healthy development of our youngest children, the well-being and health of parents and so forth. We talk about the context of social disconnection and alienation, which is experienced in a very profound way by many parents, particularly those who come from already quite vulnerable communities. There's an additional context, which the political scientist Moises Naim talks about, which is polarization, post-truth, and now I'm forgetting the third P. But I want to talk to you about polarization, particularly in the Australian context. How is that being experienced? And I know you haven't been there, but how is it being experienced in particular in the work on behalf of all parents and all children, particularly in light of the failure of the voice referendum a few months ago?
Look, I have to say that the Voice referendum result will endure, I think, as one of our greatest failings. If you look at the outcomes for Indigenous Australians compared to non-Indigenous Australians, it is clear that there is an entrenched gap and that the status quo isn't working, and the Voice was a modest proposal that had incredible support among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and as an option to start moving the needle, simply by virtue of what we know is that if policies are developed in tandem with the communities that those policies impact, you get better outcomes, and really the Voice was a mechanism for that process to occur in a sort of systemic way. That it failed is just absolutely devastating. And it really, I mean, I wasn't there, but from all accounts, it really did typify the sort of the pain and problem of polarization. So we saw a whole lot of arguments gain traction that were not true. So one of them was that there were conservative and right-wing commentators and Indigenous commentators as well who were saying the Voice is an elite proposal. It's only about people in power. Aboriginal people don't want this. One of the saddest moments, I think, personally for me, but I know a lot of other people shared this, was when the results of the referendum came out, and in our most remote Indigenous communities, and they are the communities that are the most vulnerable, the percentage of people who had voted for the Voice, it was sort of high 70s, high 80s, high 90s, consistently around the country, like right around the edge and right in the middle, and they are the people that would have been impacted the most. And yet, during that campaign, one of the most successful arguments that the No campaign ran was that Aboriginal people didn't want this. And it created this polarization that we know it really did encourage a lot of people to vote no, because they genuinely believed that it wasn't what Aboriginal people wanted. And we now know with the results, actually they did. And I guess the way that the key way that I see polarization play out for the Parenthood and for our sort of the advocacy that we do, and it's something that we are really mindful and intentional about, but it's certainly tempting. And I mean, I've had this over the course of my career when I have argued for things like access to paid parental leave and access to early education and care, you get these sort of arguments that therefore I mustn't care about my children. That it's either you love your children and therefore you stay at home and you raise them and you look after them and you don't ask for any help, or you don't love your children, you're a monster and you want to work, instead of actually looking at, well, what's the context here? Do we live in a country where parents can freely make the decision to not work for 5 years? If that's what they truly wanted. We don't have a system where that's an easy choice to make. Some people make it, and some people want that choice and can make it, and that's fantastic. But the idea that we have got this sort of either or, it definitely gets traction in certain, that we know that there is an attachment to sort of outdated social patterns that, mums should stay at home and dads should go to work. The world that we argue for is actually we would really like parents, men and women, mums and dads, to be supported to care equitably and to participate in that. And we don't have that at the moment. And so when we talk about things like having paid parental leave that dads take, it's not about saying mums want to get away from their children and they don't want to look after their babies. It's about saying that if you have got a family and there are two parents or two caregivers, you can make that a shared pursuit. And actually, when it is a shared pursuit, children do better, but also the mental health of both men and women is improved, which is not surprising because it's such a big undertaking. We know that. And when you support people to share that share that care and share that responsibility, it's easier. But there is definitely scope for polarization there. And on the one hand, I'm tempted to say, we had a turning point last year. We had an election and we'd had a Conservative government in power for 10 years. And we had a change of government. So we've now got a progressive federal government. And actually almost all of our states now are run a progressive as well. It certainly doesn't mean our job is done, because there's a lot of work, but we do have commitments to these issues, and we do actually now have the most representative and diverse federal parliament that we've ever had, in terms of, we've actually got a lot of parents, men and women, that have got young children that actually know these, they know these issues in a way that, maybe a politician who was in his 60s or 70s, who's always had a wife that could do everything at home, they don't understand these issues. It is to them black and white. Well, if you love your children, you'd stay at home with them. Therefore, we don't need to talk about paid parental leave, and we don't need to talk about early childhood education.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and super interesting for me as an American here, as we're entering a presidential campaign season with the oldest candidates I think we've ever had, certainly ever had. Right. Georgie, this has been a great conversation. I always like to conclude by asking our guests, what is one project that you have dreamed of but haven't started yet? And that could be personal or professional.
Well, actually, having this time off has really solidified a project that I am really keen to do, and it's a podcast for the Parenthood. It's talking, I actually started doing some of the research for this earlier this year, but talking to parents who have had the experience of being made redundant while they are either, on parental leave with a new baby, or when they've just come back to work, or when they've told their employer that they're pregnant. That sort of discrimination remains so rife in Australia. I had about 15 conversations over 2 days at the beginning of the year, and almost word for word the stories were the same, but these were women from all over the country in different lines of work. So there were people working on shop floors, there were people who worked in banks, and it just shocked me how identical their experiences were. And that's a project I'm really keen to get up next year.
Well, great. Well, we will look forward to that ourselves. Georgie, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your time in Canada, the rest of your parental leave without the baby, and good luck with the transition back to Australia and back to home and back to your full-time work at the Parenthood. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for this opportunity.
Great. Have a great